Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To old companions in terror and darkness, I greet you again as old friends. To those who are hearing my voice for the first time, I must impart a warning, directed to those of a delicate or sensitive nature. Tonight's broadcast will not be a kind one. What you are about to hear are tales woven from the most nightmarish of thought, tales both thrilling and evil. Should your morbid curiosity get the better of you, I welcome you to stay with us and remove yourself from the world you believe. But know that you have been warned. My name is August Reach, and we will now begin. Good evening. This time I will begin with an apology. The bounds of my contract dictate I am to provide a broadcast every 2 months, though due to ill health that I cannot resolve in time, I have been unable to fulfill that requirement. I have recovered from my affliction only partially, the physical aspect having ceased, yet the trauma of my condition remains, and I am still within recovery. Please forgive this indiscretion, and I assure you I am on track to fully regain my constitution. Nevertheless, I must recite my tales, for although consequences will surely befall me for falling behind in my duties, they will only grow worse should I not attempt to remedy the situation. I have debated this greatly, for with a weaker mind I am more likely to be influenced by the forces I beckon, but the necessity outweighs the risk. Have you ever had a knock at the door late at night when you weren't expecting guests? It's common policy to answer regardless. It may be a friend or family member in need, or some unfortunate soul seeking aid. Many of us are deeply cautious, rightfully so, of some opportunistic ill intent preying on our good nature. If you were to ever find a small marking of some kind, or a suspicious out-of-place object upon or near your property, lock all doors and windows and ensure all curtains are drawn by nightfall. Our first story is titled Dollmaker. Dad told us not to leave the house, Darcy pleaded with her brother, but she had never swayed him before. Dad says lots of things, especially when he's out drinking. Mum won't be home for another 2 hours and I'm bored. Let's go out. Darcy made no attempts to hide her nerves. Where are we going? Does it really matter? Elijah scoffed. The sun is out and I want to explore. Are you coming or not? I can't let you go by yourself. You might get hurt. Elijah stamped his foot down at this. You're only 10 minutes older than me, Darcy. Stop acting like such a grown-up. Do what you want, but I'm going. Elijah turned on his heels and began to walk down the winding road towards the center of town. Wait! Darcy shouted as she quickly put on her coat and shoes, locked the house up tight, and ran to meet her brother, who had a good lead on her. You're really going to get us in trouble for this. You didn't have to come with me. I couldn't stay in that house all day. It's not fair. Well, it's a good thing you've got me with you to stop you doing something stupid. You're the one who's stupid, Elijah retorted as he pushed his sister away lightly. The walk from their house into the center of town followed a few back roads for some time, before reaching a main road that went in a straight line directly into the high street. Darcy was only 11 years old, but knew all the shops and roads in town in her many walks with her mother and brother. She had found some incredible spots, the finest restaurants with gourmet food, Mr. Aldenton's curiosity shop that had all sorts of strange and wonderful things, along with all the stalls out on the market that she'd help her mother shop at each week. Elijah was far too slow to know the town like she did, and if she left him alone for too long, something always happened. He'd scraped a knee from a trip, got a black eye from a fight, he'd even broken a bone last year after he fell out of a tree. Still, Elijah never thought of what might happen to him, always laughing and running headfirst into strange situations. They arrived in the high street, laughing and walking as they explored the streets. Elijah would occasionally kick a can across a road, or the two of them would gaze at the toys on offer in some shop windows, making a deal to write them down when they got home so they wouldn't forget. The sun sank quickly that evening as the time flew past, and it was soon time to head home. I know a shortcut, Darcy exclaimed. No, you don't, Elijah snapped. If I don't know any of his shortcuts, then you definitely won't. Maybe you need to stop hitting things and look around more. Her smug smile filled her expression as she took a sharp left and through an alley, moving onto Willow Street without going around. See? Told you. Elijah stuck his tongue out at her and kept on walking, hands in pockets with a sunken face. Darcy followed closely behind before noticing a shop was still open. She had never seen it before, but it looked so old. The sign above read Mrs. Gardner's Dolls in a flowing font, with a large open window display to the left and a worn door to the right. Elijah? Darcy's words caught Elijah's attention, and he slowly moved back towards her. What is it? Come on, we have to get home. Have you ever seen this store before? Elijah turned and stared at it for a while. Darcy looked at him, waiting for an answer. No, never seen it before. Well, don't you think that's weird? We've been in town a dozen times at least. Elijah looked bored. Dolls are girls' toys. Why would I care? Let's get home or Dad's going to punish us. It was your idea to go out. I want to go inside. It's late, Darcy. It's probably Elijah's words fell away from his mouth as he spotted the open sign through the glass portion of the door. Darcy, let's see it tomorrow. We need to go. No, I'm going in. We never get to do anything I want to do. It's not fair. Stop being so stupid. We need to go. Darcy pouted and took the key out of her pocket, pushing it into her brother's hands. Do what you want, but I'm going, she mocked as she stepped away from him and opened the door to enter. Elijah looked towards home nervously, but thought better of it and stepped inside with his sister. Darcy entered cautiously, seeing no one behind the counter and no other customers inside. The store was narrow but long, with numerous old-looking cabinets and drawers, with many intricately designed and prettily dressed dolls everywhere. There were dolls of all shapes and sizes, dressed in all manner of pretty clothing that Darcy felt envious she could not wear. Elijah entered shortly after, and she saw him visibly grow cautious when he too realized the store was empty. Darcy felt cautiously intrigued, however, whereas Elijah was clearly very uncomfortable. You've seen it now, Darcy. Can we go? This place is really creepy. I quite like it, Darcy said as she walked further down the store. Elijah slowly followed her, eyeing up all the different dolls, and looked like he grew more afraid by the minute. Darcy knew he wanted to leave, but she was enjoying herself. It was his turn to be dragged along to something. She moved over to a set of drawers in the far left of the room, with a small rosy-cheeked doll stood perfectly atop it. She reached her hand out to grab it, as an old woman suddenly stepped out from the back room. Young lady, if you do not intend to purchase that, I'm going to have to ask you not to touch it. Darcy quickly pulled her hand and met the old woman's gaze nervously. I'm sorry, miss. I just thought she was so pretty. Oh, I'm sorry, my dear. I didn't mean to be so stern with you. The older woman approached her and knelt down next to Darcy, with Elijah assessing her from the other side of the room. Every one of these dolls are very special. I take very good care of them. Do you have any dolls of your own? Darcy nodded quickly. There's no need to be shy, dear. I won't bite. My name is Mrs. Gardner. I've owned this store for many years and collected many of what you see here since I was a bit older than yourself. Mrs. Gardner turned and spotted Elijah, trying his hardest not to be seen. His body tensed up as he was caught in her glare. Oh my, it's not very often I get a young boy in here. Mrs. Gardner stood up and walked over to him, almost looming over the young man. Are you two friends? She's my sister. Elijah's words were timid as he spoke. Oh, I understand. I can't imagine many other boys your age are interested in dolls. I am not interested in dolls, Elijah shouted. Dolls are girls' toys. My sister just wanted to see them. Mrs. Gardner's complexion stiffened at Elijah's response. Young man, there's no need to be so aggressive. You should respect your elders. Elijah's conviction wilted again, and he stared at the floor. Mrs. Gardner lifted his chin with an outstretched hand. My, you two are definitely the sensitive type, aren't you? Mrs. Gardner pinched Eliza's cheek, much to his discomfort. "And you are both adorable as well, so I can forgive your bad manners. Besides," Mrs. Gardner moved back towards the dolls stood on the drawer next to Darcy, "these dolls are not toys, heaven forbid." "If they're not toys, then what are they for?" Darcy asked. "Oh, well, they're like a precious vase or a beautiful bouquet of flowers. They are collectibles that can be worth a lot of money to some, but to others like myself, I simply enjoy looking at and appreciating their beauty. I stopped playing with dolls many years ago, my dear, but I never stopped trying to expand my collection, and I own some very rare dolls indeed." Darcy had never heard of dolls being valuable before, and grew bolder with excitement. "Are there any very rare dolls out here?" "Oh no, my dear, they are far too valuable to be left in the shop where anyone could damage them. No, I keep them somewhere safe where prying hands cannot reach them." "May I see them?" Elijah stepped forward at this comment. "Darcy, we have to go. Mum and Dad will start to worry." Darcy stared daggers into her brother, but he stared back, locking the two in place before Mrs. Gardner interrupted. "Oh, I don't normally show my precious collection, but you're obviously quite excited. A quick peek, my dear, and then you can be on your way. Would you like to see as well, young man? Even if they are girls' toys, I think you'll find them very interesting." Mrs. Gardner's smile made Elijah squirm, but he nodded reluctantly. "Lovely, come this way." Darcy excitedly took the lead, and Elijah followed closely behind. They followed Mrs. Gardner through the back door into a narrow hallway, right up to a closed door. "This is my workshop. I'll show you one at a time, then you can be on your way. Young man, you can come in first." Both children were confused by this. "It's only my sister who wants to see it. Just let her in." "Oh no, my boy, this is very special. A few seconds, in and out. Come on, the shop's closing soon." Mrs. Gardner opened the door and beckoned Elijah inside, who reluctantly stepped in. Darcy stepped forward, but Mrs. Gardner stepped in and closed the door in Darcy's face. She waited for almost a whole minute, hearing some quite strange noises coming from the other side of the door. The door swung open again, and Mrs. Gardner stood there, but Elijah was nowhere to be seen. "Okay, dear, would you like to come in now?" "Where's Elijah? I thought we could only go in one at a time." "He was so insistent that you had to see it together. He was quite taken with it, to my surprise." Mrs. Gardner moved to the side, allowing Darcy passage, and she reluctantly walked past her. Again, Mrs. Gardner closed the door behind her. As Darcy entered the room, it was filled with perhaps a dozen very large dolls, all in sitting positions up against walls. They had regular clothes on for the most part. Some had a fancy dress or a nice jacket. Her heart froze when she noticed a doll on the right that looked exactly like an old friend of hers that had stopped going to school a long time ago, and she moved forward to touch the doll's hand. Upon contact, she pulled back in fear. The hand was far too soft to be a doll's hand, and all at once she realized this was a body. She turned on the spot and saw Elijah's body slumped into a corner. She screamed out a shrill cry, but a cloth was put over her mouth, and she quickly fell into a deep sleep. Darcy slowly awoke, a bright light filling a closed room with no windows. There were numerous tools and glass jars, strange items all around her, and as she tried to move, realized she was tied to a chair and had a piece of cloth strapped around her mouth. She struggled, crying through the cloth as she did, trying to make as much noise as possible, like Mum and Dad had always taught her. She heard more noise and looked over to see Elijah in the same situation, dread and fear shooting from his gaze as he looked to his sister for help. Darcy doubled down her efforts. She was terrified. She desperately cried for her mother and father, though the noises she made were more like mumbles. "Children, no one can hear you." Mrs. Gardner entered the room with a large bag, placing it down on a nearby desk. "Now, stop this noise. You're better than that." "Oh, look at you both. You've lost all that beautiful complexion, but we'll soon fix that." Mrs. Gardner opened her bag and took out a long silver tool that seemed to Darcy like it had a small spoon on the end, along with a very narrow and thin pair of scissors. Did you know the eyes were the first things to lose their beauty in my earlier collections? She took a stool and placed it directly in front of Elijah. It was such a shame to see such beauty gone to waste in such a short space of time. Of course, all things lose their luster eventually, but this was simply not good enough. So I needed to replace the eyes. She sat on the stool and grabbed Elijah's head to meet her gaze. Now listen very carefully, young man. What I'm about to do will hurt enormously. You must not cry. You must not move or scream. If you do, I will do much worse to your sister, and a brother must be brave for his sister, mustn't he? Or what kind of man will he grow into? Nod if you understand. Elijah took a quick glance to his sister, then looked back at Mrs. Gardner and nodded. There's a good boy. Now, stay still. Mrs. Gardner took the long silver tool and with steady hands lined up the spoon-like end with Elijah's lower eyelid. He began to cry, but she began pressing gently at first, then with more force, past the eyelid with Elijah streaming tears. The tool slid under his eye. Mrs. Gardner leveraged the tool downwards slowly, Elijah loudly whimpering as his right eye strained against its socket, before finally popping out a few centimeters from his skull. Mrs. Gardner moved with horrifying precision, using the tool to support the eye while she took the long scissors in her other hand. Darcy realized what was about to happen and screamed. Elijah began violently shaking, but did everything he could to stay still for his sister. Mrs. Gardner leveraged the tips of the scissors behind the eye and lined them up with the optic nerve with surgical precision. With one quick snip, Elijah cried of a pain and fear Darcy had never thought possible, and she screamed and thrashed and kicked as Elijah's eye fell from his face and rolled across the floor, a trickle of blood flowing down his face between terrified thrashings. Mrs. Gardner stood from her desk, her demeanor of calm never once falling away to nerves or emotion. She cleaned her tools and moved over to take the eye off of the floor before turning back to the children. I'll be back soon, but remember what I said. If you struggle against the next one, your sister will be hurt far, far worse. So do be a good boy for me. And Mrs. Gardner left the room. Darcy looked over to her brother, who had wet himself among the screams and tears and blood. He looked straight at the ground with his one good eye, seemingly withdrawn from this horror. Darcy knew if she came back, they'd both die, so she kicked and thrashed and struggled until the chair fell onto its side with her attached. The impact dislodged a small part of the chair's structure, and she could feel the binds on her hands loosen. She pulled and twisted and struggled until the rope on her hands was loose enough to be released, and once free, she quickly took her gag away and removed the binds on her legs. She rushed to her feet, running over to Elijah, who had almost passed out from the trauma. She hugged him and wept. I'm so sorry, Elijah. It's all my fault. I'm so sorry this happened. She composed herself quickly and untied her brother, lifting him from his chair. At this apparent proof of freedom, Elijah came to his senses and began to cry fresh tears again. We're going to die, Darcy. No, we're free now. We just need to get out of this shop. Can you walk? Elijah stood up straight on two shaky feet, before nodding and following his sister as quietly as possible. They reached the front of the shop before they heard the shrill cry from the back. Children? Children, where are you? Get back here this instant! They abandoned stealth and ran straight to the front door to find it locked. They smashed at it and screamed for help, pulling and twisting the handle to no avail. Mrs. Gardner came through from the back, brandishing the same white cloth. I'm going to have to punish you very severely for this, you naughty children. She moved with surprising speed, weaving through the cabinets and drawers with frightening grace. The children weaved and dodged themselves, barely avoiding her swipes in attempts to stop them as they ran around the store. Elijah pushed over a large cabinet, barely missing Mrs. Gardner but smashing several dolls in the process. She cried out in anguish, rushing to her dolls. She took one into her hands and her face twisted with rage, and the twins felt fresh fear as she became a demon in her efforts to grab them. She took a nearby ornament and hurled it at Darcy, missing her and smashing the window in the door. Elijah followed this by jumping upon her back and began beating at her head. "Run, Darcy, through the door!" Darcy looked to her brother, just as Mrs. Gardner got the upper hand and pushed the cloth into his face, putting him to sleep in seconds. Before Mrs. Gardner could recover and pursue Darcy, she seized her chance to get help and climbed through the broken door window, severely cutting her hands and legs in the process, but she was outside in the streets. She looked back to see Mrs. Gardner had given up pursuit, so ran as fast as she could straight back home through the empty streets. A small mob descended on the doll shop quickly afterwards, but it was too late for Elijah. No one would tell Darcy how he died, but even her drunken father had wept like a child alongside her mother when he heard. Mrs. Gardner was nowhere to be found by the time they arrived. Darcy was told she wouldn't get far. Everyone was looking for her now, but she knew they were lying. The next day she took all of her dolls, and in front of her sunken parents, cast them into the fire. After placing the mark, they will come for you. Virtually nothing is known about their origins. They may even be mortal people like you or I, though I have other theories. They will knock on your door loudly and desperately after dark, seemingly in a panic, but you will hear no cries for help or voices of any kind. Do not answer your door. Do not look through spy holes or discreetly look out windows. To see them or let them enter is suicide. They will begin violently trying to gain entry. The door handle will rattle angrily and the door will be struck over and over. After this fails, they will then begin attempting this on other doors and windows simultaneously. Do not react. Even the thinnest glass is an unbreakable barrier if left alone to endure. After some time, they will admit defeat and leave, but you are not safe to look or go outside until sunrise. Our final story is titled The Fog and the Wolf. I suppose you want an explanation. Some sort of clarification as to why I committed the most heinous of crime beyond impulse or fancy, and I am inclined to provide it. Before I say goodbye to you all, I will provide you with a recounting of that tale, to put to bed any rumor or speculation that no doubt jumps easily from tongue to tongue in my self-imposed exile. I am sure most of you will recall Alison, her beautiful dark blonde hair, her truly warming smile, and the whimsical and light-hearted nature she naturally exuded in all her actions. I would imagine her corpse does not elicit such emotions, but we must all try to remember her as she was, not what she became. I must forewarn, however, there is no exaggeration or fantasy present in my words, yet there may be elements you find to be disturbing or difficult to believe occurred. I assure you I myself have questions unanswered about the incident, and admittedly am afraid to explore their possible answers. I believe forces were at work that day beyond mine or Alison's control, and they may not have been of an earthly nature. Nevertheless, I swear I write only the truth, unabridged, as best I remember it. Myself and Alison had been married for little over 2 years, courting for 5. As many of you know, we were active in the community. Alison more than myself, as I found charity to always have the same effect as a mother's kiss to a bruised knee. Effectual in its intent to lighten a heavy heart, but never seeming to truly address a problem. Alison had no such conviction, truly believing that to help in any way was to improve the world around us. I admit I found this rationale naive at times, grating even. We lived in a small house quite central to the town in a neighborhood populated by primarily families with many young children about the place. We would often sit on the porch and talk for hours, watching people come and go through all hours of a lazy Sunday. I myself worked as an accountant for Trescoats, a small firm located on the corner of Broach Street. I had wanted to move to the city where my talents could be put to greater use, but Alison insisted we stay near to her parents to support them after the loss of her sister several years prior, and I did not feel strongly enough about the issue to persist. My employer was Casper Trescoat, who I'm sure a great deal of you are already on familiar speaking terms with. I admit even now I found him to be a kind, pleasant gentleman who I diligently worked for, though I doubt it would bring him much joy to know I was the one praising him. In his employ were myself, James Thornhill, and Luke Platt, all suitably experienced gentlemen who kept a tidy profit flowing into the business. On the evening of May 12th, I remember becoming involved in a heated debate with Alison about some issue or another. The details elude me, where my resulting foul mood persisted through my sleep into the next day. I arrived to the office feeling sunken and dreary, hoping to bury my angst in my work. "Morning, Andrew. You're uncharacteristically late." "Apologies, Casper. I did not sleep well." I dragged myself to my desk and sat into my chair with a heavy slam, which caused Casper to drag his gaze away from his own papers. "Good God, man, you look dreadful. Did you sleep at all last night?" I slept quite soundly for all of 3 hours. Casper stood from his desk, making his way across the room to loom over me and inspect me with inquisitive eyes, whilst I vacantly stared up at him. "Ah, your wife is to blame." I shook my head lightly, a response which markedly hid my utter amazement of his deduction. I will never understand how you are able to read such things, and honestly it scares me to think of sometimes. "It is a gift, my boy, one I have honed over many years. Of course I can never know the reason for you and your wife's disagreement, but nevertheless that is no excuse for tardiness. A personal problem should be contained behind closed doors, lest you give this business a bad reputation." I stewed on this notion a while, hoping for more compassion, but being forced to acknowledge my own shortcoming in the matter. "Where are James and Luke?" My voice was strained, the thick stack of papers on my desk only added to my heavy mind. "They've been running errands for me all morning. I should expect them back any moment." Casper's voice was sharp to respond, with no too subtle a hint that I too should begin my daily errands. I passed through the papers with what felt like a dreary mist present in my thoughts for what seemed like hours. I had made a sizable chunk into the stack of papers when I came across a sealed envelope addressed to myself. When did this arrive? My sense seemed to fire back into awareness all at once, and I noticed both Luke and James had returned some time ago. I was met with silence. "James? Luke?" "We hear you, Andrew." Luke never took his eyes from the papers on his desk. James seemed not to notice at all. "Well, when did it arrive?" "I don't know, Andrew. I have work to do." Luke's voice was, for some reason, loaded with venom. "Oh, for God's sake, what childish games are you two playing?" My outburst was met with both men stopping work to simultaneously glance at me. "Come on, out with it. Have I offended you in some way?" The two men turned back to their work, and I was left dumbfounded. I felt no need to press the issue further. If they wished to act like pouting women, then I would let them. It was almost 12 anyway, so I grabbed my coat and headed out, taking the strange envelope with me. I grabbed lunch and headed to a nearby park to read the letter, whilst I pondered the strange behavior of my co-workers. I slid my thumb under the paper's edge, lifting the wax seal away easily. The letter inside was an invitation to both myself and my wife to visit her Aunt Dorothy down near Dorchester. Why in God's name was it addressed to me, and to be sent to my work residence rather than our home? The proposed date of the invitation was this weekend, when I had already been scheduled to dine with Casper and his wife. This was an excellent excuse to refuse, and I was altogether rather uncomfortable with the strange circumstances regarding Dorothy's sudden invitation. She had only mentioned her briefly. There seemed to be no strong connection there. I finished my lunch and made my way back to the office, where I finished my day's work in relative silence, as my co-workers were still in some sort of pathetic rut. On my walk home, I felt a dark shroud fall over me, as I remembered the reason for my initial foul mood, and how no doubt when I walked in I would once again be berated for some seemingly inconsequential thing. I opened my door to find a surprisingly warm smell of roasted vegetables and meat. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to," Allison spoke as she came over to me and firmly kissed me, which came as altogether a surprise considering the argument had not been settled. My memory is hazy, but she apologized for the disagreement, stating that the lavish dinner was by ways of an apology. My mood soared. I heartily devoured the meal and retired to smoke by the fire, just becoming settled before I remembered the strange envelope. "Oh, Allison, I forgot to mention to you." I stood as I spoke, fetching the envelope in my coat pocket and making my way into the kitchen. "I received this letter today from your Aunt Dorothy." "Dorothy? Why was it addressed to you?" "I haven't the slightest idea. I thought you might know." "That is strange." She took it from my hand and began to read. She put it down lightly on the counter when she had finished before turning to look at me. "We have to go." "What? Why?" "She must be in trouble. Something is wrong." "Allison." I couldn't help but smile at this strange reaction. "Darling, I admit this is odd, but nothing here seems threatening. Perhaps she's simply feeling lonely or wants to see family." Then why address it to you? Why send it to your work?" "For the life of me, I don't know, but we can't assume this is some infernal plot. Perhaps you know we're going to Jasper's. Besides, you know we're going to Jasper's this weekend for dinner." "We can do dinner any time, Andrew. Please, this could be important." "Enough," I spoke firmly. "Allison, your aunt is fine. This is some strange note, and she simply wants company. And while I would like to go as much as you, we simply cannot. Now consider the matter closed." I took the letter and returned back to the fire, putting the letter back into my coat pocket. The atmosphere of the evening soured after this, but she would see I was right. The next morning I made my way back into work, in a decidedly better mood than yesterday. I entered the firm with a renewed vigor to banish that stack of papers by the end of the day. As I made my way to my desk, however, I heard muffled yelling coming from Casper's office. I made my way over to the door, and in an uncharacteristically conniving moment, pressed my ear to the door to listen. Inside were James and Casper, clearly having a heated debate. "But why? Why not me? I've worked here twice as long as he has. I helped you make this business what it is today." James' passions were flared, something I didn't think the dullard was capable of. "Only half of that is true, James. Now, you may have been here longer, but frankly, you've been dragging your heels with your work, and had your fair share of mistakes I had to clean up. So I have to be perfect to be given recognition? No, just better than Andrew at your job, which you are decidedly not. That is why it's going to him." At this I entered the room, boldly swinging the door wide. "What is going to me?" The room fell silent for a moment, before James gave me a piercing look and strode out of the office, out the front door and onto the street. I turned to Casper, seated behind his desk. "Well, am I not owed an explanation?" "Take a seat, Andrew." Casper sipped his tea as I closed the office door and sat awkwardly in his old chair. "I'll get right to the point. I'm leaving the business to you once I retire." My mouth fell agape. "I never asked for that," I managed to squeak out. "If you had, I would have made a great effort to keep it from you. As it stands, however, you are my most skilled employee, have a thorough knowledge of the business, and show an aptitude that the others do not. Yes, I know you have your moments, and this is only a small firm, but I see great potential in it in your hands." I was dumbfounded. Why was he doing this? "Did you ever consider that I don't want it?" "Nonsense, you've put your heart and soul into this business. Of course you want it." A heavy silence fell for a moment. "A thank you would be appreciated." "Casper." My anger in my voice grabbed his attention firmly. I don't want the business. I am grateful to you and thoroughly enjoy my work, but I do not want that level of responsibility. Not to mention that James and Luke would never consider me their superior. Casper let loose a small smile. Oh, they'll come around when their children start to complain about not having food. I doubt they'd find such senior positions elsewhere that would take them. And you'll come around as well. This is an excellent endeavor, and you'd be a damned fool not to take it. I pondered for a moment and got up to leave. Where are you going? Casper questioned. I need some air to think. What's there to think about? If I truly want to be a fool or not. I closed the office door behind me and made my way into the streets. I took only a brief walk around the streets before returning to the office, finding James diligently working at his desk, Luke nowhere to be seen. I quickly resumed my work, hoping to lose myself in my task and let these events simmer peacefully in the back of my head. Casper had shut the door to his office, but the occasional cough or shuffling of papers was enough to confirm he was still working. Once 4:30 struck, myself and James packed up our things in silence and both vacated for the night, without a word to each other or Casper. My mind had not settled on a decision at all through the long walk home, and the decision seemed to grow heavier with each passing step. What the hell was Casper playing at? I admit he was in his autumn years, and the thought of who would succeed him was a natural one to have. And without arrogance, I can confidently say I was the prime candidate for that role. James was too sluggish and quick to make decisions, whereas Luke lacked a subtlety to his knowledge, likely due to not having the capacity to see the bigger picture. Both passable workers, but workers only. But my anger was flaring no matter how I reasoned it. Casper's treatment of the situation was at best unprofessional, and at worst downright arrogant. He had come to a decision entirely on his own, with not a care in the world for my thoughts of the subject. Perhaps I had ambitions greater than his pathetic accountancy firm. Perhaps I wanted to move away, or even move into another business entirely. I became more and more repulsed by the idea of accepting his offer, and would be sure to tell him tomorrow morning. Once I arrived home, I remembered the meal my wife had prepared for me the day prior, and my mood once again lightened. No doubt a relaxing evening with a full stomach would calm my thoughts, perhaps even help me see a new perspective. Once I entered the house, however, there was no smell of food lovingly cooked, nor even the warmth of a lit fire. I made my way through the kitchen into the living room to find Allison crying. I rushed to her side and knelt beside her. Darling, whatever is the matter? Oh, Andrew, I couldn't. I went to see my parents today, showed them the letter my aunt sent us. They dismissed it, said it was nothing to worry about. Well, there you are then. I don't know why you fret so much over a letter. Because I know she's in danger. I know my aunt. Every instinct of my soul tells me she needs me, needs us to go help her. I stood up, dragging my hands down my face to compose myself. Darling, I'm only going to say this once. You are becoming delusional. Your aunt is fine, all right? If she were in any greater danger, she would contact the police, not send us a cryptic letter. Allison stopped crying and wiped her tears, her eyes meeting mine with a piercing gaze. Fine. If you won't believe me, I'll go myself. No, I'm not letting you go alone in this state. Oh, for Christ's sake, Andrew, you're still thinking about that oh-so-important dinner with Casper, aren't you? Mention of his name brought my mood lower, but I realized then there was no way in hell I wanted to have dinner with that man now, or any time soon. My going to Allison Aunt's and cancelling plans last minute would no doubt offend him greatly, and maybe he'd seriously consider the offence he had caused me. We're not going to Casper's this weekend, nor any time soon. Allison's anger seemed to melt away all at once into concern. What? What happened at work today? Do you still work for him? Of course I do. He can't afford to lose me. I took a seat on the couch. Casper has informed me that I will be inheriting the firm once he retires. Allison was taken aback, but maintained better composure than I had. That's excellent news, is it? I barked. I wasn't consulted on the matter. He believes that any sort of breadcrumbs he feeds me are to be diligently thanked for, and that I should eat them straight from his hand. I thought you wanted a higher position. I sighed. She could never understand a professional setting. Allison, my thoughts were not considered at all. If I take the position, then by all means we're stuck here for possibly the rest of our lives. I don't want that burden. Plus, I would excel far better in a larger city firm. It would be better for both of us, don't you agree? Allison remained silently and hung her head downward, a sure indication I had assumed incorrectly. After a moment I went over to her and held her head on my shoulder. Look, I have no desire to socialize with Casper and could use a break now myself. If you truly, truly believe your aunt is in danger, we should go and check on her to settle your mind. Allison held me tightly at that point, a feeling I accepted and returned in kind. Thank you, Andrew. I know I'm being silly, but this still doesn't feel right. We must go check on her. I honestly could say I would rather be anywhere rather than be in Casper's company that day, so the decision to go was thankfully convenient. I knew her aunt was in no great danger, and this visit would confirm that and return her to the woman I married. The rest of the week crawled by a remarkably slow pace, not aided by my co-workers' disdain, nor Casper's poorly suppressed anger when I declined dinner. Even when I told him of my wife's concerns for her aunt, the timing made me look to be giving some half-hearted excuse, and frankly, I was delighted. Now he could be the one to walk with injured pride, his feelings carelessly discarded. I made sure to finalize all work perfectly that week, double and triple checking so that I could make an early departure on the Friday at around 2. My wife had spent the day packing our belongings and met me at the train station to begin the 2-hour journey. The trip was pleasant enough, with scenery morphing from pleasant green fields and far-off horizons to large, jagged hills dotted with trees and livestock. Allison, for the most part, was clearly in a better mood, but still concerned about her aunt for the duration of the trip. Myself, I was delighted to read and tried to forget about Casper entirely. Allison did not come from money, her parents being hard-working, honest people who gave their best efforts in life to care for their 2 daughters. Allison's Aunt Dorothy, on the other hand, had had the good fortune of catching the eye of a rather wealthy man, far wealthier than Casper, and married him with little over a year of courting. The marriage, I was assured, was not out of a desire for stability and wealth, but I could never fully quell my suspicions. That was until he tragically passed away from an infection of some kind. I am ashamed to admit I suspected foul play, until the funeral where Dorothy was inconsolable. Even my suspicious heart was softened that day, as she had spared no expense to give him a grand funeral, and has taken no suitors since. She does, however, still live in a luxurious manor situated inside a woodland area, which is quite rare for an estate so close to the coast. When we finally arrived at the property from the train station, it was still as beautiful as I remembered some years prior for the funeral. Dorothy came straight to the door to greet us, looking alive and well, as I had always known she would. "Allison, my dear, so good to see you," she shouted as Allison ran to hug her aunt. "Oh, Aunt Dorothy, I'm so glad to see you so well." Dorothy pulled back from Allison, her hands still affectionately holding her upper arms. "Well, why would I not be?" "The letter you sent Andrew was incredibly peculiar, Aunt Dorothy. It made me believe you were in some kind of great trouble and needed help." "Oh, you foolish girl," she quipped. "If I were in danger, I'd have simply gone to the police or contacted a friend nearby. I certainly would send a letter of invitation to your husband's employment." Allison frowned noticeably. "I was very scared for your well-being, and your letter didn't help at all. I was distraught. Next time you send a letter, address it to me and send it to my address." "Of course, my dear." Dorothy and Allison once again hugged. I put the luggage down and gazed skyward to take in the full beauty of the architecture. Her late husband was a man of impeccable taste. "I must say, Dorothy, it's a relief to me to see you so well also. Allison almost managed to convince me you were in great peril." I smiled at her as she rested her chin on Allison's shoulder in the embrace, but the gaze she returned to me was cold and almost threatening. Had I done something wrong? Before I could ponder further, she released the hug and gave Allison and myself a warm smile. "Please, I've prepared your room. Follow me and we can get settled and you can tell me how your parents are doing." I grabbed our belongings and followed Allison and Dorothy inside, trying my best not to dwell on the disapproving glare. The inside of the manor was surprisingly densely decorated, with ornaments and paintings upon each wall, giving the glow of some family legacy or ancestral pride. I surmised this must have been most of Christopher's family belongings, and Dorothy either liked them or hadn't the heart to replace them. It was certainly a warm and comforting place to live, and I found myself relaxing further with every step I took. Once we had arranged our belongings for the night, we ate a hearty meal and chatted in a grand seating room as the daylight hours waned, giving me ample excuse to light a roaring flame in the marble fireplace. I smoked and listened to the two women discuss matters of family and life, only occasionally interjecting as I enjoyed listening, and Lord knows the two of them enjoyed talking. I barely thought of Casper at all, but when I did, I delighted in knowing he was stewing in his own resentment. The hour reached 11 and the conversation began to wane, so I proposed we all head to sleep and rise early for a brisk morning walk. The two women agreed enthusiastically, and we all turned in for the night. I do not know the hour, but I was awoken in the dead of night by a door being slammed shut. Allison was still sound asleep as I shot upright in bed, and I daren't trouble her with some noise in the night, but my senses were on high alert. In a property such as this with only one resident, it would be no surprise that thieves and lowlives would see it as a remarkably easy target. I rose from my bed and crossed the room slowly, taking the time not to creak any of the wooden floorboards, and slowly unlocked the bedroom door. It was located just to the left of the top of the main staircase that ascended the left side of two walls of the main foyer, giving me a clear view of the front door over the banister. The door was ajar by the smallest of margins, but enough to allow a thin beam of moonlight through, and tell me the force of the slam must have ricocheted open partially. I focused intently on any sounds or possible movement in the dark, but detected nothing. I knew that Dorothy had locked the front door from the inside, and I heard no one ascend the staircase, so if there were to be people in the house, they must have broken the lock and still be on the ground floor. I stepped out of the door and made my way down the stairs, one delicate placement at a time. The foyer seemed twice as large, with entrances to other rooms both either side of the front door and one below the staircase I could not yet see. Any small creaking the large house made or gust of wind set my mind racing. I made it to the bottom of the staircase and quickly locked the door once again, confused that the lock was intact and the key still in it. I turned and took my time to peer down the hallways of the 3 other doorways branching from the room, with the hallway leading under the staircase being the most intimidating. I took myself for a lap of the ground floor rooms, passing through the dining room into the large ornate kitchen, before doubling back round through several lounges and completing my lap into the foyer. Nothing. I once again headed upstairs, now believing perhaps Dorothy was playing a trick on us for some nefarious reason. As I once again reached the top of the staircase, I peered to the right to the end of the corridor, where a large window was spilling moonlight onto the carpeted floor. So bright, in fact, I could clearly see a thick fog had fell upon the forest. I moved swiftly to the window and gazed at the tree line, which was perhaps 100 yards away from the manor, to see the incredibly thick fog would not spill from the trees. It seemed to stop at the boundary of the green lawns of the estate in the woods, like a great sheet of glass had stopped it from flowing out. What chilled my heart was to see Dorothy, stood in her nightgown perhaps 10 yards from the tree line, staring into the fog. I immediately rationalized perhaps this was a nightly routine, or perhaps she walked in her sleep. But then she turned her head and looked directly at me, her gaze altogether erasing my constitution. Her expression was neutral but willful, her complexion and mannerism closer to that of some lifeless model than any living human should be. Then she returned her gaze to the woods and walked through the tree line, the fog swallowing her from view in a few short feet. I was dumbfounded, terrified. This was surely a nightmare. I hurried back to the room, locked the door, and willed myself into a sleep. I was awoken the next morning by Allison shaking me, and when I turned to give her a morning embrace, I found she was in fact already dressed and out of bed. Allison? Why are you already dressed? If I slept in, you should have woke me sooner. She's gone, Andrew. Dorothy, I can't find her anywhere. She's not in the house. I inhaled sharply, recalling last night's events. Realizing in my morning acuteness they were far too vivid to be imagination. I saw her last night, Allison. What do you mean? She sat on the bed and tightly gripped my arm. I heard the front door slam last night, so I got up to investigate. At first I suspected some burglary, so I searched the manor and found nothing, but then I recall I saw a dense fog among the trees on the borders of the property, and your aunt was stood there. She somehow knew I was watching her. She gave me a quick glance, then walked into the fog. Is she known for nightly walks? Allison's complexion paled, and her hands began to tremble as she gripped me. I knew it, she muttered. I knew it. She is in danger. This isn't right, Andrew. Surely you saw her last night. Even you must believe this to be a cry for help, the reason for the letter in the first place. I wanted more than anything to calm her, to tell her this was nonsense, scold her for such delirious imaginations. But I couldn't. So many strange things were coming together, that unnatural fog, the way she somehow knew I was watching her. I mean, what sane and stable person would vanish into dense fog in the dead of night with nothing but a gown on? This was not normal behavior. I believe you now, Allison. She is likely still out in the fog. We have to go search for her. Allison began to cry, bellowing tears as she collapsed into my lap. I lifted her and held her tightly. I can't lose her as well, Andrew. I can't lose her and Emma. You won't, my dear, I promise. I am so sorry I doubted you, but we can still help her here. It wasn't that cold last night. If she fell asleep in the forest, I doubt she took ill. Let me dress and we will find her. Allison wiped her tears as I leapt from the bed. I dressed quickly and we both headed quickly outside. The night had been crystal clear, but great clouds had swept overhead, and a chilling breeze sharply took my breath every few seconds. Myself and Allison were both wrapped up warm, but if it were to get colder, I feared for Dorothy's safety. We made our way to the border of the tree line, and then about 15 yards away I saw it again. The fog pouring out from the darkness of the deeper woods towards us, flowing and billowing in place once it hit the border. I froze in my tracks, causing Allison to turn towards me. Andrew? Andrew, what is it? It's that same fog. It's the one I saw last night. Allison came to my side and wrapped her arm under my own. It's just a fog, my dear. My aunt could be in danger. We must go in, please. She pleaded, pulling at my arm to get me to move. She was right. It was just a normal fog, no matter how it behaved. Yes, of course you're right. There's no time to lose. My heart raced as I neared the wood. Something I'm sure Allison could feel pounding out of my chest, though she said nothing. We breached through the thick grey veil, and after a moment's hesitation, continued walking. Once inside, the fog seemed to thin in several directions, allowing us around 30 feet of vision, but no further. The trees seemed more spacious as well, often being on average 20 foot or more apart. Myself and Allison held each other close. Dorothy? Dorothy, can you hear us? It's Andrew. Talk to us. My shouts were seemingly swallowed by the fog as I received no reply. Allison eventually gathered her courage to release me and started moving away from me whilst calling for her aunt. Do not go too far from me, only a few feet to be safe, my love. The truth was I did not wish to be alone. The trees felt warped and unnatural. The fog felt more like a predetermined maze than a natural weather effect. We walked straight ahead for some time, continually shouting and looking upon the ground for clues to her whereabouts. It was almost half an hour of fruitless wandering before Allison began to break down crying once again. I rushed to her side and held her. Oh, Andrew, where is she? We should have found her by now. As I rested my head on her, I noticed the fog begin to crawl further in. It felt like the motions of a predatory cat sneaking and curving round obstacles to try to approach us unawares. My fear grew, and I held my wife even tighter. Then, a snapping branch not 20 feet away from us. Myself and Allison stood up and looked, to see a wolf fearlessly meeting our gaze perched upon a tree stump. Allison let out a small screeching noise, but I grabbed her. Be still, and do not make a sound, I whispered into her ear. She nodded. The wolf met our gazes and seemed to inspect us from top to bottom. After a brief pause that threatened to freeze my heart, the wolf dismounted from his perch and began walking away. Myself and Allison let out a heavy breath, but I kept a firm eye on the creature. As it walked, the fog seemed to shrink back from it, giving me clear sight of the wolf even 50 feet away. It then stopped, turned back to us, and sat down. I was at this point perplexed, but unbelievably curious. "Allison, look." She turned and strained her vision, realizing the wolf had stopped moving. "Why has it stopped?" I moved away from her, drawn towards the wolf. Andrew, what are you doing?" I don't know. Why is it here? Have you ever heard of a wolf in this part of the country?" I bloody have now. I can see one. "Andrew, get back here. It's not safe." But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. I kept my eyes locked onto the creature. It seemed to beckon me over. And the way the fog parted for it. "Allison, we should follow it." "Andrew, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious. I have no idea where we are anymore, but this wolf would know the way. It could even lead us to Dorothy." "Andrew, don't you dare suggest she was..." I turned and glared at her. "It hasn't attacked us. It likely didn't attack her. Maybe it's looking after her. Come, let's catch up before it wanders off." I smiled as I resumed walking towards it. "Andrew, please, this is madness. We should..." I turned again, enraged beyond reason. "Allison, will you do what I say about arguing for once in your fucking life?" My voice boomed, but likely didn't go far through the fog. Allison was visibly shaken and made no protest, following closely behind me. A few steps further and the wolf began walking again, trailing further into the woods. Our pace was slow as I felt reluctant to get too close to the wolf, and it moved at its own leisure. It never seemed to show offense or even interest to our following, but did check we were still in pursuit several times. The path it took seemed trodden before, like a well-weathered route that perhaps made for a nice walk on a summer's day. Truthfully, I was no longer following for Dorothy. I felt well and truly lost, and trusted this animal with baser instinct could tell a way forward. "You've never trusted me, have you?" Allison's voice pierced my concentration, and I turned to find her stopped dead still, staring at me. "Of course I've trusted you. We don't have time for this." "But you haven't, have you? Every decision we've made as a married couple has been either yours or from your father or your employer or someone who isn't me. Why do I not get a say in this marriage?" I gritted my teeth, checking the wolf. It didn't stop moving this time, and the fog was cutting off our path. "Allison, contain your lunacy. We have to escape this forest." "Escape? We're looking for my aunt. I thought that was why we were following this thing." Her temper had fled, but I didn't have time to entertain this nonsense. "We need to ensure we're safe before we can save her. I've been lost an hour. How about you?" The fog was quickly drawing in. Soon we would lose the wolf. "I don't care if we're lost. Once we find my aunt, we can get out of here together. You're doing it now, making decisions without trusting me. You always do this. Do you even respect me?" "Why should I when you're always acting like a spoiled brat? You can't even go a day without talking to mother and father about something. Your husband should come first." "How dare you? You spend every day you can thinking about to please Casper, and when he rewards you, you spit in his face because you're so entitled you think you should be able to choose your own gift." I raised a hand and struck her across the face, mad like a bull. How dare she? How dare she after everything I'd sacrificed for her pathetic, childish whimsies? I turned and the wolf was gone. I then noted the tendrils of fog had swept closer again. This time visibility was more limited, perhaps 20 feet in any direction. Fear gripped me again. I turned to Allison, cowering on the floor, and a wave of guilt swept through me. My God, what had I done to my beloved wife? I knelt to her and began to weep. "I'm so sorry, my love. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. Please forgive me. I'm so scared." I wept heavy tears into her dress, and I felt her start to cry as well, and before my senses regained themselves, we were crying and holding each other. I'm sorry too. I didn't mean it. I'm just so frightened. I'm so scared for Dorothy. I wiped my tears away and steeled myself. We'll find her. But I think our best course of action is to return to the town and amass a search party. She may even be back at the manor already. Are you sure? She could be hurt and afraid in here, Andrew. I know, but we're lost ourselves, and that won't do her any good even if we find her. We must secure ourselves before others. Let's head back. I helped Allison to her feet and gently kissed her. We will find her, I promise. We attempted to retrace our steps with no success. We recognized nothing as we moved, the fog ever shifting, concealing trees and other objects, and I strongly began to feel it moved with purpose to obfuscate our surroundings. I kept shouting for Dorothy, but there was never any reply or hint of her passing through. I felt like she wanted this. She wanted to seemingly vanish, but for God's sake, why? There was no logical reason for it. Was inviting us up to visit a joke of some kind? A cry for help she had to bury under riddles? It was infuriating, and I was quickly growing tired and hungry. We took a short rest by a particularly large tree to catch our breath. What time is it? Allison asked. It's midday. We've been out here for almost 3 hours now. None of this makes any sense. You said she walked into the forest of her own will? That's what I saw. I can't make sense of it either. Just as I closed my eyes, Allison shook my arm violently. Her face was locked in terror, and I turned to once again see the wolf, no more than 5 feet away from us. Allison gripped my arm like a vice, and the wolf began snarling. It paced around in front of us, so we were forced to keep our backs to the tree, no avenue of escape. It let out a mighty growl, and Allison let go of my arm and cowered away from me. The wolf stopped snarling and retreated to a distance of 20 feet, then stood and waited. I felt betrayed. My wife, in fear, decided to cover herself and hide away, leaving me vulnerable to attack. But the wolf seemed uninterested in seeing me as food or a threat. It wants us to follow it again, Allison. Allison turned back to me, bewildered. You can't be serious. It just tried to attack us. We must be close to the manor by now, and we're not following that damned creature again. You said I didn't trust you. Well, I'm not telling, I'm asking. It obviously seems domesticated. Maybe the growl was to get us our full attention. It might be trained to help people out of the fog. Even as I spoke the words, I knew Allison could tell I was lying, but I wasn't about to deal with another of her childish fits. She couldn't argue with logic, and it was true the wolf was clearly docile in some way. Who knows? Maybe my insane, rambling logic might be right. Allison stood up and began following the wolf without saying a word, so I quickly jumped to my feet and followed after her. We moved at a much brisker pace now, and once again the fog felt like it was receding as we followed our unlikely guide. I felt more sure of myself, more defiant as well. Allison, at the slightest hint of danger, had cowered by herself, leaving me to take the attack. What kind of loving wife would do such a thing? Admittedly, I didn't jump to her defense myself, but the positioning was wrong. She was in front of me when we were both frozen in fear. I couldn't protect her if I tried. Allison's silence and refusal to look behind her deepened my frustrations. There would be long talks once we had found her aunt, who herself would be given a stern lecture for wasting my damn time. You've never liked my family, have you? The words were like small knives as they met my ears. My face flushed red with suppressed rage. Allison, what the hell does that have to do with anything right now? Just admit it, and I'll be satisfied. You've never cared for my parents, have you? She didn't turn to face me as she talked, doggedly pressing forward through the trees and undergrowth as the wolf had now wandered away from any kind of predetermined trail. Truthfully, Allison, I have no strong feelings towards your parents either way. Your father and mother are simple people. I truthfully do not care. That was the truth. They weren't annoying or bothersome, but they were equally uninspired and served me no purpose. You've known my family for 2 years, and you couldn't care less if they died tomorrow, could you? What are you blabbering on about? Can we do this once we've escaped the fog? Suddenly, the wolf stopped and turned towards us, staring. Both myself and Allison froze. The wolf sat down and stared at us, intently. I was feeling more nervous the longer I held its gaze, but Allison once again interrupted, blabbering on. This is the first time in our marriage I've tried to confront these feelings, and you think I'm blabbering on. Do you even care if we find my aunt, or are you simply going to convince me she's dead once we leave this forest so you can run back to Casper? Oh, for Christ's sake, this is ridiculous, I shouted into the trees. What have I done to deserve this, I've sacrificed so much of what I wanted to be with you. You've sacrificed, her voice bellowed through me and was swallowed by the fog. I gave up my dreams for you, you ungrateful pig. Oh? What dreams would they be? I've never once seen an inch of ambition in you other than being determined to criticize my every waking moment. Oh, that's rich, coming from the man too weak to start his own firm, like he's complained about for the last year. My temper had reached a boiling point, and I was quickly losing sight of what should remain unsaid, but honestly did not care by that point. Weakness. Let's talk about weakness, shall we? Which one of us was so pathetic they needed to move closer home to Mummy and Daddy? Allison's face looked like a bullet had struck her chest. You mustn't say that. You know why I had to move home. You know why! It was too late. The inferno in my heart had burst forth, and there was no stopping my true feelings. Oh yes, poor dear Emma. At least she doesn't have to see her sister turned into a gibbering mess after her death. I hope you'll cry half as much when your beloved husband dies. Maybe she truly is better off dead, Allison. At least that way she'd never have to know you were the favorite in the family, with how much your mother and father spoil you now that she's gone. Allison was stunned. I knew I had crossed a line that could never be recovered from, but I was beyond caring. Finally, I could express the truth in my heart about how truly pathetic my wife was. Any normal person would have recovered from her grief and moved on, but not this perfect princess. The wolf got up and continued walking at a brisk pace. I took notice just before it vanished in the fog and began walking after it. Allison, still too shocked to speak, quietly followed. Soon she was ahead of me, clearly now just as intent on leaving this fog as I was. I realized as I watched her move just how miserable she had truly made me. I was locked into a loveless marriage with a woman I despised, someone weak and pathetic who dwelled on the past instead of looked into the future. I would never get the respect I deserve from her, not truly, only if I did, would no doubt be met with her incessant whining every day for the rest of my life. My head began to feel heavy. My heart thudded in my chest. And then, light. An opening out of the fog no more than 50 yards ahead. The wolf began to run, and so did me and Allison. I was right. The wolf was indeed leading us out of this accursed fog. I could feel the excitement course through me, to feel the heat of the sun, to not breathe damp, clingy air, to feel my freedom. The heaviness returned to my head. There would be no freedom. Not with Allison around. My feelings would always be second. My needs met last. I was not supposed to be married. I was not supposed to be caged like a bird. I needed to fly free and unfettered. I needed to escape. Myself and Allison saw the clearing and charged forward, past the wolf who had stopped short, and we broke free of the fog and forest, back into the large lawn out the front of the manor. We both stood, gasping as we caught our breath. I turned to look at Allison, still breathing heavily, and my decision was set in stone. I found a large nearby rock and picked it up, moving towards her. She stopped gasping and turned to me. Andrew, I wanted it. Her words fell short as I struck her across the head with the rock, knocking her out cold. Her blood flowed effortlessly from her wound onto the wet grass, filling me with relief. I moved towards her and straddled her chest, then began rhythmically pounding the rock into her face over and over again. I laughed wildly as I did so, ecstasy overwhelming me as her blood splattered all over my face and clothes, and by the time I grew tired and stopped to admire my work, all that was left of dear sweet Allison's face was a splattered mess of viscera and her beautiful hair. I stood up from her corpse, threw the rock aside and turned back to the fog. The wolf was sat on the forest boundary, patiently watching the whole time. I thought how funny it would be if he came over to feast on the body, but instead he stood and walked back into the fog and quickly out of view. I chuckled lightly, then made my way back to the manor to pack my things and start my new life. I do hope this explains what happened, although there are likely many more questions as to why I did it. Impulse is seldom a good reason to those who cannot sympathize, and I would advise you to focus more on the questions I also cannot answer about that strange fog, and the wolf inside it. Truthfully, however, I do not care. I am free. Free to do with my life as I wish and indulge my true hedonistic self. For you see, Matthew and Teresa, I know you'll be the most keen to read my note, and you'll likely blame yourself for your daughter's death. But you should know something else. I was the one who strangled Emma all those years ago. I had developed a maddening need to be with Allison, and in grief knew she would be like putty in my hands, so I strangled her little sister and the rest fell into place. If it makes you feel better, she never knew it was me. But I realize now it wasn't your daughter I truly wanted. It was the thrill of the murder I craved, but I was in denial about my true nature. That is no longer the case. I suspect I will live a short life and die as brutally by some other person's hands for my sins, as I have no intention of suppressing my desires anymore. And already, your family is not the only one suffering. But make no mistake, for I know you quite well, Matthew. Don't try to pursue me. If I ever see you again, I will take it as a threat and make sure your wife pays the price. So be sure to leave me alone, as a good lad. You have been warned. Carter Miller is documented as the only person to witness the visitor's malice without succumbing to them. He knew nothing of the precautions I have told you this evening, but fortunately lived a secure and almost paranoid lifestyle, accidentally following my rules, which saved his soul. The first night they came, he screamed at them to leave, or he would call the police, but when he did, the police never arrived. The visitors came every night after for a week, bashing and knocking at his door after dark, trying to gain entry, and none of his pleas for help were ever answered. He grew unhinged with fear, and on the Sunday morning left to stay with relatives and explain his story, begging them to return with him. He returned to the house with them the following day, all bearing witness to the visitors' terrifying carnage, at which point I was contacted. As he had vacated the property in his terrified state, he had neglected to close one of the back windows, allowing the visitors entry. The inside of the house was chaos, furniture destroyed and food half-eaten and discarded, inexplicable filth covering the walls and ceilings, with an unbearable stench filling the air. It was not until closer inspection that they discovered the drawings. Photographs of Carter had been rooted out of drawers and boxes, each one placed among graphic depictions of violence and torture. They had even entered his attic, and found a portrait of him that they set upon a drawing of a man being forcefully turned inside out. Carter is now a broken man, living in assisted care, and no one knows anything further about these incidents. Do not take chances with the visitors. My broadcast has now concluded. You may extinguish your fires. Good night.